Hello and welcome. I'm Debbie Nelson with Alternative to Meds podcast. And I always get super excited when there's someone I feel that has made profound changes in the world. And this is an individual that I'm very pleased to do this interview with. And it's Jim Gottstein. He is the founder of PsychRights and also the author of the Zyprexa Papers, which caused a huge enlightening for individuals. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Debbie.
James, I'm different in the sense that, anytime I interview people, I get excited like I'm talking to a rock star. And when I align with people that I feel have made profound changes and have tried helping people, that's the way I feel when I'm talking to you. So, but on the flip side, I always like to kind of start it out. What was the inspiration behind all of this work that you've done?
Well, first, you're very kind. Well, I had a psychotic break in 1982 when I was 29, and I'd gotten into a situation where I hadn't gotten sleep. And I've come to learn anybody who doesn't sleep for long enough will go crazy or psychotic.
Right.
Before that, I had no idea that my, mind could be, and my thinking could be unreliable. And anyway, so I could tell the whole story. I thought the devil was coming down the hall. I had just literally maybe fallen asleep for a second. And I woke up and thought the devil was coming down the hall. I was in a second floor bedroom, and I looked out the window, which I knew, and there was a lawn down there and a sidewalk, and I was a skydiver, so I knew how to do a parachute landing fall. And I figured if I missed the sidewalk, I would be okay. And it was like 1 a.m. in June, which means in Alaska it was light. And I jumped out of the window in my underwear at 1 a.m, did a parachute landing fall, didn't hurt myself, ran across the street. And anyway, I kept looking over my shoulder for the devil. And so I was spinning around. And they came in a paddy wagon and, took me to the psych hospital. And I was basically locked up there for 30 days. And that really changed, the whole direction of my life. And I feel like I was, I know I was very lucky not to have been made permanently mentally ill by the system. I was told, let me say this, those that believed I was a lawyer said I would never practice law again.
And you're a Harvard graduate. So it's not like you're just some little law school. You had some substantial education behind you, right?
Well, yeah, but when I told them that I had gone to Harvard Law School, that confirmed I was delusional to them. So, of course, it was, they could look it up, but they didn't bother. They just figured I was delusional when I said I went to Harvard Law School. So, but my mother got me hooked up. She was the head of the Alaska Mental Health Association at the time, with this great psychiatrist, Robert Alberts, who basically said, anybody who doesn't sleep will, go crazy. And you just need to learn to manage how to, manage your situations. And so that's what I've done. But it made me
so wait a minute. The psychiatrist that you saw, you were lucky enough to have him say, wait a minute, you were sleep deprived. He didn't label you at that point?
He didn't. I got out of the hospital with a diagnosis of atypical psychosis.
Okay.
And then my dad had found a psychiatrist in New Rochelle, New York, which is where Rob and Lori Petrie lived. This is, the Dick Van Dyke Show. But anyway, he was a nice enough guy, but he didn't do much for me. He diagnosed me with, or labeled me as bipolar. So Yeah, I suppose I had that label. It wasn't a big deal for him, but in order to bill insurance, you got to have some sort of
Right.
diagnosis. So um, I'm actually not sure what Dr. Alberts diagnosed me with for billing purposes.
So when you got this, then how this was the background as to what you're on. So you realize how quickly and how easily it is that it's either sleep. I mean, I talk to parents daily or loved ones that, um, you know, with alternative to meds center, I hear it all the time. And then on top of it, you also recognize there's all different types of psychosis, and there's all different induce how people can get psychotic episodes, blood sugar and sleep and drug induced. But unfortunately, many people, when they receive that diagnosis, get locked into a mental health system that keeps them ill.
Well, basically, the message that I was given was right. I said, they said I would never practice law again. But the basic message of our mental health system, or I like to call it the mental illness system, is abandon hope, all ye who enter here. And it has horrible consequences. There are literally millions of people whose lives have been ruined by this approach.
So, what inspired you to start PsychRights? I mean, obviously your own story, but then when did this activism kind of really take off for you and you decided, hey, there's something really wrong?
Well, I had done some other work in the field. I actually was one of the lawyers in this giant case where the state of Alaska stole 1 million acres of land that was granted to it in trust for the necessary expenses of the mental health program. Anyway, so that was a big lawsuit, which resulted in a big settlement. And then I was on the Alaska Mental Health Board for a while, and pretty long time, and which was a statewide planning organization for mental health services in Alaska. And I founded a couple of consumer organizations, mental health consumer. I hate that label, but anyway. And I pretty much knew the story about the drugs, but didn't think there was anything particular I could add to the effort to, expose them. But in 2002, Robert Whitaker wrote the book Mad in America: Bad Science, Bad Medicine, and Enduring Mistreatment of the Mentally Ill. And to me, not only was it a really terrific read, it's a great book that I highly recommend, but it was a litigation roadmap for how to challenge forced drugging based on the drugs not being in people's best interest. And I contacted Mr. Whitaker and got him he actually sent me all of the research on which his book was based, which is posted on the internet on PsychRights.org on our website. And that's when I founded the Law Project for Psychiatric Rights, PsychRights, in order to mount a strategic litigation campaign against forced psychiatric drugging and electroshock.
And sadly enough, I mean, I just in the news last week, I don't know if you'd heard, there was a 6-year-old that was Baker acted.
Oh, yeah.
And it made me absolutely, when I saw the video and they show her, she's actually quite calm as they're bringing her to the police car. And sadly, it continues all the time. I mean, I almost always know when I have someone that's reaching out for help, they'll say, it started with my son was diagnosed ADHD. And unfortunately, after thousands of calls of talking to people, you almost always know where it's going to lead, because they really were most parents are just doing what they think is responsible by helping their children. And unfortunately, there is a huge population of children that are put on psychiatric medications, and they're thinking they're doing it for the better of their education, and sadly enough, it's not,
Well, they go to people that are the supposed experts on this, and they should be able to rely on them to give them accurate advice. But sadly, that's just not the case. And what's happening to children is horrific, and especially foster children, because they are just, upwards of 75 to 80% of foster children are given psych drugs.
That percentage is astounding. It doesn't surprise me. I work as an activist also in the addiction community. And when I've gone to help people with alternative forms like amino acid therapy for balancing their brain and helping them for addiction issues, I sadly can't help them because the ones that are on Medicaid and Medicare that have gone through addiction programs, they're on upwards of about 10 medications. And they're in their 20s. They're in their 20s. And the system, especially when people are in this, it really is about taking personal activism to your own personal what's good for you. And that's the mission of the podcast, is to give people resources to say that it isn't just for the wealthy, that this information is getting readily available on the internet, and this is a growing movement that's not going to go away. So it isn't, now it means that you have to start self-educating as to what you need to do. But, until some of these reforms and more people speak out and join arms and get together, this reform is so desperately needed. So that we don't have year-olds that are Baker acted, for behavior issues.
Right. Well, I mean, first off, plug my book. I mean, one of the main purpose of writing the Zyprexa Papers was to try and bring attention to the truth about all of this stuff. And so many, virtually everybody finds, or let's say the vast majority of people actually find that being psychiatrically hospitalized is more traumatic than whatever it was that brought them in the first place. So then not only do they have to deal with, the situation that, caused them to be brought to the hospital or go to the hospital, but then they have to deal with the trauma of how they're treated in the hospital.
Right. So your book, the Zyprexa Papers, was inspired from your class action suit that you filed. Tell us.
No, not exactly. Right. No. So, I was just sitting in my office at the end of November in 2006 when I got a call from this expert witness in this big case.
Okay.
Who had been given access to documents for purposes of this case. And the documents were subject to a secrecy order. And the secrecy order provided that if he was subpoenaed for documents, that he had to give Eli Lilly, the manufacturer of Zyprexa, reasonable notice and an opportunity to object before he gave any documents to whoever subpoenaed them. And so he wanted me to subpoena them so that he could legally get them to me and then get them to the New York Times, with whom he was already working on a story by Alex Berenson to get this information out about how Zyprexa was causing people to get diabetes and other metabolic problems and gain massive amounts of weight, and that Lilly was illegally marketing it to the elderly and children. So he was involved in this big case. It's technically not a class action, but I had to have a separate case to subpoena the document. So then, that started this whole adventure. I mean, just the process of trying to find a case was a little bit of a adventure in itself.
I can't even imagine deciding you're going to go up. It's like going up against a pharmaceutical company. I mean, and doing this, it seems like almost scary. I mean, honestly, they're so powerful. I mean, when you went through this process, it had to be mind blowing as you're getting this documentation.
Well, I knew that they would be upset, but you have to keep in mind that Zyprexa, well, it was literally killing tens of thousands of people. And Lilly was hiding this. And so it was just so important to get the information out that Dr. Eagleman and I were, prepared to, live with the consequences of doing that. But, we tried to do it legally, although the judge eventually ruled, not so eventually, it all happened pretty fast, but he ruled that I had conspired to steal these documents. And Lilly was, threatening to charge me with criminal contempt, civil and criminal contempt, and to try and get me disbarred and all that. So yeah, it was pretty scary, but I felt that what was at stake made it worth it.
That's what makes you a rock star. I mean, when people are willing to say, this isn't about money, this is about what's right, that's what's pretty amazing. And there are so many people that are still affected by Zyprexa. I think it's one of the, the drugs, when someone tells you they're on it, your heart kind of sinks because you know what the ramifications of it are physically.
Right.
So.
Well, people in the public mental health system diagnosed with serious mental illness are now dying, have a 25-year shorter lifespan on average than the general population. And they try and say, oh, that's because, they have schizophrenia. Well, no, at the turn of the 20th century, in 1900, people diagnosed with serious mental illness, which had normal lifespans. And it was really with the introduction of the neuroleptics in the mid 50s, starting with Thorazine, that lifespans for people diagnosed with serious mental illness started going down compared to the rest of the population. So, it's very negative. I mean, I call these drugs neuroleptics, and they're marketed as, quote, antipsychotics, but they don't really have antipsychotic properties for most. And that's marketing hype. A neuroleptic means seize the brain, which is what they basically do. They block 70 to 90% of the dopamine in the frontal lobe, and the basal ganglia and the limbic system. But so they block all this dopamine in the frontal lobe. So it's basically a chemical lobotomy. And that's really what the system sees as the therapeutic effect, is they just make people unable or disable people from being able to, be as troublesome as as what brought them to the hospital. But this oftentimes is just a temporary thing, and then the whole thing is basically nuts in terms of trying to help people.
So your book, the Zyprexa Papers, is on Amazon. PsychRights that you formed.org. We'll put all of the links linked with this so that people can get this information to be able to read the book. To obviously, your website is a wealth of information, of resources also for people that feel as if they are looking for help, what they need to do. Do you have any other advice whenever someone reads something like this, they feel like they were definitely wronged by this?
Well, I think, one big caution is it's important not to just stop these drugs abruptly.
Absolutely.
And there's some good resources for that. There's a free publication on the internet called The Harm Reduction Guide to coming off psychiatric drugs or something like that. And that's there's a link to that on the PsychRights.org homepage. And Dr.
That's
Peter,
a really important point. I'm glad that you said that, because so often that's the number one thing, is that someone will hear that and immediately they're like, I'm taking myself off of this. And
right. And what happens, I said that the neuroleptics block 70 to 90% of the dopamine in the frontal lobe and other places. And so what happens is the brain first tries to compensate for that by pumping out more dopamine, to compensate for the blockage. And then after a few weeks, it starts growing more dopamine receptors. So while they've never proven any kind of brain abnormality in people diagnosed with schizophrenia before the drugs, they see all kinds of brain abnormalities, including shrinkage of important parts of the brain after they've taken these drugs. So, but the point is you've got all these extra dopamine receptors, and if you just stop the drug, abruptly, then that does actually cause a lot of symptoms for a lot of people, and so then of course there's people in the system say, oh, see, your mental illness is coming back, and when in reality it's a drug withdrawal issue. And so it's really important to be careful about coming off these drugs. And some people find it impossible to come off of. There are a lot of people find that they can get down to a pretty small dose and then have trouble coming off the last little bit. And my philosophy is it's a lot better to be on less than more. The benzodiazepines like Klonopin and Xanax, those are particularly addictive. And you can even have seizures if you come off them.
Those are actually some of our most difficult medications for individuals too. But I always say there's a healing process, that the body is amazing when we give it the right environment, the right therapies, the right resources. It's amazing what our body can do. That medicine isn't bad for a stabilization period of time that it needs to. But if we start looking at the root issues that are driving what's going on, but you're absolutely right. I think oftentimes individuals hear or know, they know the side effect, they're living it.
Yeah. Well, there's pretty good evidence that about 80% of the people that, present with a first-time psychosis can be helped to get through it without the neuroleptics, and just get on with normal lives, get through whatever it was that they're getting through. And then there's something to be said for using a benzo for a very short time to, reestablish sleep. But you have to be really careful with that. I mean, for example, for me, if I'm getting in trouble, and it's not rocket science for me if I'm not sleeping, and I know the signs. If I am really in trouble, I'll take a benzo for just one night and to get some good sleep, and then break that, that cycle. But even just one night, one dose, I know that the next night I'll have trouble getting to sleep. But that's, a pretty small price to pay for avoiding, going crazy. But again, I emphasize it's really important not to take the benzos for more than, I think, just a few days at most.
Well, I think that's what's wonderful, is the world of integrative psychiatry is really expanding. There's numerous schools that are actually having graduates that are coming from it, that are getting trained, so that that's not their first line of defense. That they're also starting to look at numerous other things that are contributing factors and what they can do to help people. So, thank you so much for taking the time, because you are a rock star.
You're very kind.
Well, no, it's when someone takes the time to write a book or to take a stand on something that's wrong, that's going wrong, terribly wrong, and trying to say that this is what I found out. This is what I'm trying to do. This is this is what I'm trying to at least give people some resources. It's one more thing. And the more that people join together and say, something's wrong with this, we've got to do something different. There's change. Change does happen, and people can get well. You're an example that people can get well. That people, given the right environments, the right therapies, the right resources, can get well. But hear that again, everyone. Do not take yourself off medication. We're not saying that. What we're saying is be educated, and hopefully not. I listened to a lot of individuals that they just took the medicine without researching prior and understanding really what they were being administered. And that we all have rights if we can stand firm. Adults and parents, we can say, look, I'm going to research this prior to you giving it.
Yeah, well, in my world, a lot of people don't have the right to.
You're right, they don't. There's a lot of people.
So that's one of the awful things. And it's one of the things, the chapters 10 and 11 in the book, the Zyprexa Papers, is about my efforts to prevent them from drugging Bill Bigley against his will. And I like to think it's an eye opener as to, how people's rights are just disregarded. And basically the judge said, well, I'll accept that these drugs are going to shorten his life, but I'm going to order him to take it anyway because, I feel his life will be better even though he doesn't.
Right. I think that you're right. I mean, when the courts get involved or once they've gone in, for a crisis or something, it's amazing how quickly that we can go from, hey, this is my own personal crisis to now it is the courts get involved. And you're right. There's many, many people that's the case, that they lose a lot of right that they shouldn't be administered these. But once they have, there's certain things that have to be done, and working with the responsible psychiatrist is first.
Right. And there's another great book by Robert Whitaker, Anatomy of an Epidemic.
Love it.
And which actually is, I think, Mad in America was very successful in Anatomy of an Epidemic, even more so. But it really describes from a societal level what's going on with these drugs, as well as a personal level. And I think people should do their research if they have the choice. They should do the research, and the bottom line is, I think that psychiatric drugs is especially used more than, the benzos, like I say, for a very short time, are basically a trap. And then you have a heck of a time trying to, escape from that trap.
That's true. I mean, honestly, it's like, and the only thing that we can do is educate the population as to what these traps are, and that if they start research and make sure that they're doing research as to whom they're seeing, if they're in that position right off the bat, or if you're already in this position, to try to find, like I said, a responsible integrative doctor that's going to get to the bottom of what's going on and see what they can do to be able to help and assist people. So that
unfortunately, there are not very many doctors, psychiatrists, or other doctors that are very knowledgeable about this. But like I said, the harm reduction guide for coming out psychiatric drugs is very good. And then Dr. Peter Breggin has this book, Withdrawal from Psychiatric Drugs, which is also very good. And interestingly, both of them really focus on having the kind of having social supports and being in a good place in terms of your situation as critically important to success, as much as how much you might taper off in a given period of time. And I think that's so true. It's very important to have.
Well, the good news is there's 2 brand new integrative psychiatry schools that are starting to teach integrative approaches. So there's psychiatrists that are now getting trained. And so, like I said, the world of integrative work and people starting to recognize they're not getting well, they got worse. The moment they started taking the medication, it was just a downward slide. So that world is starting to take hold, thank goodness. And they're starting to get, I always refer a lot of people to the innercompass.org, the withdrawal project. So there's a lot more resources that are out there to be able to help individuals who are in this situation and seeking solutions as to how now to get their life back on track or how to help them heal. So that's the great news. So whenever like I said, I'm like, well, I'll be damned. We're going to lock forces. The more of us that speak out and the more of us draw, lock arms and say, we're here and it's not going away, that this has to change, that there has to be there has to be options for individuals so they can have a quality of life. We're not going away. So it's going to continue. So individuals like you are like rock stars that have started something, and there's like a next generation, and more people are starting to say there's something wrong, and then they're finding this. So the more resources and podcasts and websites like yours and books are just valuable resources. So thank you so much for taking the time and doing this interview for us. So again, it's one more interview. All the links for the book will be below this video, and for your website, for PsychRights.org, so that people can go and read exactly all of it. But the book is amazing. It gives people an insight is exactly, what you discovered with really what's going on. So thank you again for taking the time from Hawaii, mind you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It was a pleasure meeting you on the camera.